Started it.
Fantastic.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Please, stage is yours.
Okay, so do you want to start briefly then with talking a little bit about the connection, etc., from what we've just discussed, or shall we just move into cohort builder stuff?
I don't know. It seems that they know what the database connection is, and Katie, Adrian, and Arthur can point other people in the right direction.
Okay. I think the only thing that's probably worth mentioning then before we properly kick off is that if you're using the same instance for training, if one of you makes a change, you might find yourself in the situation where that's not necessarily reflected in your RDMP software, because it's not keeping in real-time sync with the database. So if someone adds a configuration or edits a configuration that's existing in the same instance of in the same database, you might find that you then go in and it looks unexpected when you bring up part of the configuration. That's because someone else has changed it behind the scenes. So just be aware that obviously if you're using the same database system, you're potentially editing the same thing as someone else at the same time. Okay, right. Where's everything going? Too many things going on. Right. What we'll do then is I will screen share. Okay, and sort my teams out. Right, so I'll just start on the training plan as we've got. So we're going to talk about cohort builder today. Session 1, creating extraction project, etc. What we'll do, much as we did the last time, if you've got any questions, raise your hand, and hopefully Joel or Adrian will bring that to my attention, as I'm not really necessarily looking at you all whilst I'm going through this. And also they'll keep an eye on the chat as well, so if you want to put any questions in there, if you don't want to kind of interrupt things as they're going, that's fine too. But please do interrupt, and I'll go into more detail when I'm talking about things, or I'll go off and kind of go into other content as well as need be. Try to keep it relatively relaxed. Yeah, as I say, interrupt, and we'll answer things as we go along. So I'm going to use the same training instance that I used last time, which is going to be similar to what you're running as well. So I think that probably makes most sense. Okay, and also I've got a short PowerPoint presentation. I might go through that first, actually, just to kind of set the scene on cohort building. I'm not quite sure how Teams is going to like presentation mode. Maybe if I stick it on another screen and then. Okay, is that working for everyone?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, that's good.
That's good, right. I've been in so many, I've never not used PowerPoint in Teams, but I've been in so many Teams where people complain about presentation mode not working. So. Okay, so cohort builder on RDMP. Obviously, this is one of the key concepts, and one of the things that gets used certainly within HEC more than probably any other feature. In fact, we use it not just for building cohorts, we also use it to quickly put together kind of feasibility numbers. So if someone comes along, in terms of Chi, not in terms of full-on aggregations, but if someone comes along and says, I'm interested in this cohort made up by XYZ, we can quite quickly put that in to our RDMP instance and come up with a number of people that are available. So it's useful in from that side of things as well. We can access cohort builder in a number of ways, as we can with a lot of things in RDMP. There is the home screen, which if you're running RDMP, you'll see the home button near the top left. And from here, you can see create new cohort identification query. We can do it through the file menu. We can make a new cohort identification configuration. Or indeed, we can do it from the cohort builder area itself. So what we've got in this portion, this is the kind of ribbon, as I refer to it, just under the menu structure in RDMP. And that's how the way I usually do it, but obviously there's options for other ways of doing it. I usually use the ribbon, and if I'm looking to build a cohort, I can click the cohort builder button, and you'll see the left-hand pane will change the cohort builder, and from there you can set up a new identification configuration. You'll see in this little screenshot here the blue highlighted area, free configurations. That is as opposed to project associated configurations. And simply put, a project associated one is associated to a project of some form, and a free configuration is anything else. So there's a little bit of flexibility in there. We can use, have I opened the old version actually, Leandro? I'm not 100% certain. I've pulled this from the teams.
You're probably, yeah, so that's what I was going to add that. There's been some changes since we did this PowerPoint. I think I wrote down that there is some UIs have changed.
Okay, let me see if I could just quickly grab the later one then. If I remember where I put it. Did I put it in the... Okay, I've got it. Don't you just love it when you download something in Teams and it doesn't tell you where it goes? I presume it goes to my downloads folder, which is full of junk. Right, let's try that again. Actually, what I'll do first is I'll drag this into the Teams environment and upload the new version. Sorry, folks. Okay. Right, where are we going now? Okay, let's try that again. The good news is most of it hasn't changed. Some of the GUIs have changed, so it's worth using the actual version. I've lost the Teams meet now. There we go. Right. Okay. Right. So where were we? Yes, various different ways to open the cohort builder. What we've done is we've removed the wizard bit, and part of the reason for that is that we never used it within HIC. I always felt it was too simplistic, and actually it just added confusion. Because what ends up happening is you end up then learning how to use the wizard, and then you also learn how to do it manually so that you can build upon those criteria that the wizard kind of puts together. So I'm not a fan. I think it's easier to just look at it from the usual GUI, because that's what you'll end up using anyway. And I'll go through this obviously in RDMP once we've gone through the spreadsheet. RDMP uses a thing called set theory, which I'm going to explain a little bit here. And hopefully some of you may well already understand set theory and some may not. And Joel, Adrian, Leandro, please butt in and correct me, as I always seem to do this wrong. I don't know why, but I'll do my best. It's a simple concept that I have difficulty with, but let's not worry about that too much. So set theory consists of a few different things. I'm going to talk about unions. So a union is basically where you take all items from all of the sets that you have. So in this case, if we've got set 1 as our red circle and set 2 as our cream circle, if we're unioning those, then what we're doing is taking all of the items that appear. If you think the item in this case is a Chi number or a person, we'll be taking all the people from set 1 and from set 2. But there are 3 options, I should say, so that's the first of our 3 options. The second option is an intersection. And you see these little logos, or the kind of set theory logos for what these things are. So intersections will take items that appear only in both sets. So if, for example, you have set 1 as people with diabetes and set 2 as people who are over 65, the intersection of those will give you all people over 65 with diabetes. So you're not getting those under 65 that would appear in the diabetes set. You're only getting those that appear in both sets. And our third piece of set theory is the exception. So what that does is it takes everyone from the initial set 1, who are not in set 2. So again, sticking with the example where we've got set 1 is diabetes and set 2 is over 65s, what that would do is give you everyone with diabetes who is under 65. Because you're excluding set 2, so you're excluding the over 65s in that case. So hopefully you can start to see how these things come together, how that can be useful in cohort building. We've got some kind of visual representations of the things. So if you look at the green line is the most important bit. So on the left here, we've got the union. So you see the green line encapsulates everyone in both circles. You can see the top right, we've got the intersection. So that's everyone that appears in both circles. This is the crossover of the two circles. And at the bottom right, we've got the exception. So it's from set 1, but not from set 2. So we've got this kind of crescent moon shaped component, excluding everyone in the cream section. The RDMP GUI tries to represent this in the logos that it uses. So I'll point that out later when we look at it. But that's the background anyway. We then go to a bit of math, apparently. So we've got set 1, union, set 2. We've got the little union operator. We've got our left operand, our first set, and our right operand, our second set. So if you imagine this is like, I guess it's kind of like, 1 plus 2, but it's set 1, union, set 2 in this case. And of course, it's the same both ways around. So if we union, order is not important. If we union 2 sets together, then it doesn't matter which order your sets are in. It is literally everyone from both set 1 and set 2. Similarly, if we intersect those, again, order is not important. If you're intersecting set 1 and 2, then you get everyone that appears only in both sets. And that doesn't matter whether the sets are in one order or the other. However, hang on, what have we got now? I've lost already.
No, the exception is at the bottom, Chris, don't worry. You'll get there.
Thanks for that.
No problem.
Okay, what we're doing here, so we're combining things. Yeah, so this is basically saying that similarly, if you union 3 sets together, it actually doesn't make any difference in what way, shape, or form you union those 3 sets together. What happens is you get all of the people from all of the sets regardless. And this next line is going to do the same, but for the intersection. So what we've got so far is that unions and intercepts do not rely on order. However, except is the exception. If we do set A except set B, what happens is we retain people from A and get rid of anyone in B. Now, obviously, that's not the same as set B except set A, because in that case, we retain everyone from set B and get rid of everyone in set A. So it's kind of like the opposite, really. So that's something that you need to keep in mind, and it means that the order that you create your cohort identification configuration in RDMP, if it features an except, is important. So basically what you don't want to do is end up taking diabetics and excluding those over 65 instead of taking over 65s and excluding those with diabetes. And similarly, if you start to combine more than 2 sets, the same rule applies. So be careful with accept and consider order. And I'll show you how we reorder these things as we move forward too. So a sample cohort, let's say a researcher comes along and says they want patients who have been prescribed diazepam for the first time after 2000 and who are still alive today. We can start by identifying the distinct data sets that we want, sets that we want. So in this case, we've got our first set is those who have been prescribed diazepam. So it's going to look at prescribing data, specifically filtered for diazepam. Our second set is first time after 2000. So we've got a kind of a date constraint on there. And the third component is the people that are alive today. So that we're going to look at kind of death records to do that. So then we can think, how do these split into the set interactions? How do we use union, intercept, and accept to split these things up? So if we take all patients who have been prescribed diazepam for the first time after set 1, sorry, and set 2 is for the first time after 2000, what we want is people who have had diazepam prescription is set 1, that's the red component. And then if we exclude set 2, which is then people who have had it prior to 2000, that's the logic that we have here. And I should have clicked before saying that because it's going to show you exactly that. Here we go. And then we've got a third set, people who are still alive, so that's our set 3, and we're going to include that as well in this little Venn diagram, which gives us set 1 except set 2, so that's diazepam, but not before 2000, and then we want to intersect it with set 3, who are the alive people, and that gives us this kind of triangular shaped green highlighted area here, and that would be our cohort. We can translate that into maths if need be, but RDMP doesn't do the maths bit, so don't worry about that too much. What we can also do is look at it in the tree structure in RDMP, where it would look like this. So what we have here, you can see the words intersect and accept being used. And you can see the little logo I was talking about earlier, which shows the little Venn diagram. So what you've got is 2 circles intersecting, and the red area is the area that you're looking at. So in RDMP, we can see an intersect is where they are in both circles, and accept is where they're in the first circle only. And indeed, there's a third logo for a union, which is completely red because it takes the whole 2 circles. You can also see the order coming in here in the accept. So we're taking everyone in the first element, and we're getting rid of, because we're accepting, we're getting rid of anyone in any subsequent set. So people with diazepam we're keeping, people with diazepam before 2000 we're getting rid of. So that gives us only people who have had it post 2000. Similarly, we then intersect the accept that we've just discussed, along with people still alive. So if we follow these little lines in the hierarchy, that shows us what these things refer to. So we can see under the accept is people with diazepam prescriptions, and we're accepting people with prescriptions before 2000. And if we go up a level, we can see this blue line here links that, intersects that container, that accept container we just looked at, with the people who are still alive. And that builds up our entire configuration in this case. It might seem like a lot to take on, especially if you haven't used set theory before, but the more you use it, the more you become familiar with it and the more it makes sense. And there's a few other things that we can look at that help to just to ensure that what is going on, what we're doing is what we expect to be doing. Okay, and that's going to explain what I've just explained. I should click and talk. That's the solution there. So yes, we've got the outermost operation as the root element. So that's basically saying that's the top of our pile. Every operand is on the same level. So these are within the except, and then our third component is the nested operation becoming a node of that. And of course, we have except, so order is very much important. Yes, and a final thing is that if we add an operation, so that's an accept or an intersect, with no or one kind of child elements, that'll be flagged. And the reason for that is that you might think you're doing something, but you're not, because you need at least two things in each of these operations for it to actually be doing anything in particular. But again, we can demonstrate that as we go into RDMP. RDMP, so if I flick back to here, you see there's these little plus and minus signs in the hierarchy, and these are just kind of header level. So what this is doing is showing us the kind of top level, and we can expand that by clicking the plus to go into it to see how that particular component is built up, and that's what's happened here. So what we've got is an expansion of each of the elements. So you can see we've still got the intersect and the accept, and we've still got the people with diazepam, etc. And we can see these little filters. So this little funnel icon that shows us we've got a filter underneath this. So these filters are what's actually kind of doing the work on the database behind the scenes. And that's how you interact. That's how you set the filters. We touched on this a little bit last time, where you import filters and set them up from the catalog, etc. And we'll look at that again shortly. And again, you see the sort of result set being laid out just in text. So we've got an intersect at the very top. We've got our exception of the diazepam prescriptions in the before 2000. And you can tell by the kind of tabulation, if you like, the tabbing in on the bullet points, what level these things are sitting at. So this is an exception, so it's take point 1, get rid of point 2, and then it's an intersect, which is intersecting all that stuff in the accept with those who are still alive. Any questions on the set theory stuff? Okay, that's good. I've either scared you all off, or you're all now a little more comfortable with set theory. As you can tell, I'm perfectly comfortable with set theory. But all that being said, I'm still happy to continue to use it. And once you see what it's doing, to me, it makes a lot more sense than thinking about it from the mathematical perspective. But we put the slideshow together because I think it does help to give a kind of background, a basis on what's actually going on. And why these things are important. Okay, so there's execution of the actual configuration. So the idea is that you pieced it together and you can execute the full query, which is to say...
Sorry, can I call you for a minute? I was a bit slow. Can you go back for a slide?
One slide. You want me to go to here?
Yeah, this one. So I got a question. No, the slides, you actually have the filter information there.
You want me to go to here?
This one, yeah. So I noticed for the people with this before 2000, for the filter, you have two filters. One filter is drug name this, and the second one is prescription before 2000.
Yeah.
So I wonder, so you use except logic here to exclude the people who have the prescription before 2000. Why don't you directly do if you are able to do the prescription before 2000, can you directly just do the prescription after 2000? And
Yes, it's not the best example that's been used, unfortunately, because you would never do it this way. You would simply add in a filter at the top level that you would get rid of the accept, and you would add in a filter along with the drug name diazepam. You'd add in one that says prescription after 2000.
Okay, so it's possible that way.
Could I just say that it is correct, as I believe, because what we want is people who were first prescribed after 2000. So it complicates it slightly because people might have been prescribed before 2000, and that's why it's using the set theory to remove those people who had diazepam before 2000. I don't know if I explained it.
Jolt's exactly right. I've lost it. Where's it gone? Jolt's exactly right. We use the word first, and that's the bit that I've missed out when I've been kind of describing through this. So because we're specifically looking for first time, you can't do it the way Sean's suggesting, because if you do it that way, you will include people who have had, who potentially have had an earlier prescription. Sorry.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
What you can do in each of these things, so this, the names against these things. So if we kind of talk a little bit about the logos, just to kind of give an idea of what each of these things means. So as I say, you've got this little kind of funnel thing which represents a filter of some description. If you're a database person, that's like a where clause, and you can see that these are containers that can be and or containers. And that's hopefully relatively obvious what that's doing. So this is looking for diazepam and before 2000. If this container was to become an or, what you would get is everyone who's had a prescription for diazepam and everyone who's had a prescription for anything at all before 2000. So be aware of the or. If you make that an or, think about what it is that's doing. We then, if we move up a little set, so the and is a folder icon with a little funnel in it. So it's kind of like a concept of a folder of filters. That's what it's trying to tell us there. We've got this parameters element, which I'll talk about in RDMP because I think it's easier to show. And then we've got this little icon here, which looks like 3 circles, and it's actually 3 people. It's supposed to be 3 people. So the little circles are their heads, and you know, it's a cohort. That's what we're saying. It's a cohort set. It's a set of people, and each of these labels beside them, these can all be changed. So what we recommend you do is, as you're building it up, you set your label to dictate what you want it to be, and then it becomes much more readable if you're handing it over to other members of staff in future, for example, or if you're going back to it after a period of time. And of course, you know, we want people to reuse RDMP as much as possible. So we very much push the idea of looking for existing configurations that might be similar and cloning and editing them for new purposes, if that makes sense. Yes, so moving back to where we were at. So you can execute the entire thing by hitting the little play button, and what that will do is it will give you a number of people at the end. So that's going to give you a list of Kais in our case if we're using Kai. You can also execute these individual elements one by one as well. And that might be important because maybe, you know, you may wish to just go in and see if it looks realistic. You might want, you know, there might be kind of performance, I guess. If it's something that takes a long time to run, you might wish to run that in isolation. There's also this concept of caching, which I'll talk about a little bit later as well. But basically, the idea behind caching is that each time you create a filter, it might take some time to run on your database server. So what RDMP can do, if you've configured a cache, is it can take that list of Kais that comes out and store it temporarily in a database. And what that then means is when you run it next time round, you know, it might take, I don't know, maybe your prescribing data takes 3 hours to run. So it can execute for 3 hours to create that cache. And if you then go back and change other elements, you might change the hospital admission component or the conditions in this case, it will only rebuild those from scratch. You won't have to rerun that whole 3-hour process, providing you haven't changed the way that you filtered it, because that Chi list is still there. And RDMP allows us to do that, and then obviously it can increase the kind of productivity and not having to wait because things have been incorrect. We also have 2 count columns, and again, I'll show this one with actual numbers that makes a bit more sense. But the first count column is for the individual sets. So in the case of this example, we've got people in prescribed data. So that's going to be a really large number, anyone that's ever had a prescription. We've then got people in hospital admissions. So that'll be quite a large number as well. And then we've got people with lung cancer. So we'll get just the count of those with lung cancer. We've got a second column called, it's a little bit obscured because the column hasn't been dragged wider, but it's called cumulative count. And that is basically where the sets are interacting together in the way that we've given them out. So in this case, you will have the number of people who appear at the top level. I think it's just the same as people in prescribing, but it will reduce as the number goes down. So it'll then be the combination, what's a union. So it'll be all people in prescribing and hospital admissions, and then with the conditions. And then when you get to the exclusion section, the number will start to go down as you exclude people who are, in this case, prescribed BNF 4.7. But again, it's easier to see in actual data, so we'll talk about that a bit later. Patient index tables. I'm kind of tempted to come back and revisit this one later because it is quite a complex component. I'll maybe just go through it quickly just now, just to give a bit of a background on it, and then we'll talk about it later as I can demonstrate it live, I think. But the idea is, if you're looking at something that, for example, might use some sort of aggregate level functionality. So this is another way we can take this first prescription. So you saw the way we did it earlier, and we had a little discussion with Joel and Chang about how that comes together. But this is another way that we can do that. So if we've got our filter for diazepam, and then we've got our, well, yes, so what we're doing is we're replacing the red component with an aggregate function, which in this case is the orange dotted section, rather than the red circle that we had in the past. So what we could do here is we can use the min keyword. So if you're familiar with SQL, there's a minimum keyword, and using a group by aggregate in SQL to allow us to find the first prescription that they've had, and then we can simply do that in a single query and implement that with an RDMP rather than use this except that we had to use the last time. And indeed, actually, the patient index tables can do other things in that kind of way as well. And I'll touch on that a little bit later as well, later in the session. What are we doing now? Creating the index. Okay, so this is the building up the actual patient index table. So what's happened here is we're in the cohort builder, and we're going to add this prescribing catalog as the basis for our patient index table, or PIT as it's been shortened to. So we can add a catalog, and we're going to add prescribing in this case, because of course it's diazepam that we're interested in. We can then look at this screen here, which is a little more technical screen, which allows us to kind of drill a little bit more into the additional functionality that we can get. So we double click the people in prescribing element here, and it gives us the screen on the right. We can change the name at the top, so we've called it first prescription. We can select some columns that we might be interested in. So in this case, you can see that Chi is selected. We can add in additional table joins if we need any, but in this case, we're just going to use it as is. And we can add an optional halving clause, which allows us to do a little bit more kind of SQL level aggregation. this looks like a whole bunch of different elements stuck together, so I apologize for that. But you can see we come from here, so we've got our component where we've got chi and no other things selected. We can pick the count records. So we're picking an aggregate. So we've now got chi and the count element. So what we're going to do is count the prescriptions that someone has. We can put in some SQL that says minimum prescribed date. So what we're doing is finding the first date that that person has had a prescription. We're simply clicking here to change the alias. So you can change, it's calling it a count column. It's just giving it an alias name that we can refer to it as later by clicking on the edit button. And then we finish up by adding it into the filters area as usual, which I appreciate we need to cover a little bit anyway. What that allows you to do is reference this count column in your query elsewhere. So where are we going now? This looks like the same bit. Yeah, so the index itself still needs to be joined to a core set, but at least the view sample should show the SQL that's been generated. So that's giving us, I did say I was going to kind of fly through this, and I'd much rather do it live because I think the slide is a slightly complex way of doing it. In fact, there's a lot of repeating going on here, which I don't like, but never mind. Yeah, because this is bringing it into the second component. And we end up with this big bit SQL at the end. I think I'm getting even more complex. I'm probably going to leave it at that and start actually looking at cohort building in RDMP if no one has any objections. So what we did, unless anyone's got any questions from any of that, actually, before I move on. Okay, so I think the last time we perhaps we'll look at the Tay-side lung cancer cohort. I think is one of the defaults that gets added in if you did synthetic data. So this is something that you should be able to see yourself, I believe. So let's just start by having a look at this. And what we'll start by doing is just looking at this existing configuration and trying to figure out what it is that it's doing just by looking at the screen. So obviously we've got lots of names, so we can trust that the name is correct and that's what it's doing, but that's probably not the best idea. So let's just have a look through and see what's going on. So we've got an inclusion criteria here, and we can see by the icon that both of our circles are filled in red. So this is a union. It's a union operation. So we're going to take everyone that appears within this element. So what I quite like to do is to collapse everything down, and that lets us see at the top level what's going on. So we've got a union of people in hospital admissions and people in conditions and people with a lung cancer condition. So we're just adding three things together and creating a large list of chi. And then we can expand each of these individually and see what's going on behind the scenes. So for people in hospital admissions, what we actually have is ICD code main is a C349. This little message is telling us that we've declared this at a higher level, so we can make the parameter values can exist within the concept of this query, or we can make it higher level so we can use it elsewhere and only have to set it once. I think I've actually edited this one, yes. So again, we can see here the same code has been pulled in C349. Similarly, I can't edit it and it's grayed out, and that's because it's escalated to this parameter level. What that means, and I've obviously used this demo instance for someone else, unfortunately, so I apologize for that. But what that means is that we're demonstrating the fact that we're only doing C349 once, and it changes it more than once. It's a parameter, and that's what this section up here is about, parameters. So perhaps you might have multiple data sets that use ICD codes. You might have, SMR1 for hospital admissions. You might have SMR 0 for inpatient stay, and you want to search both at the same time. And what this allows us to do is to set the code once and avoid errors by accidentally keying it in wrong. Keep in mind, it could be a list of codes rather than just one. It might be 50 codes. And we can edit it in that way, and that's what I've obviously demonstrated to someone else. So if I go into here, we can see the different that it's used in 2 areas and it's set to 3, 4, 9. Again, if I expand the, oh yes, so that's another thing we can note, of course, is that whilst it says C65, that means that someone hasn't actually edited it. So be aware that you want to keep your labels matching what your data says. Otherwise, you can end up in a bit of trouble there. So the labels are there for your ease of looking at it rather than for any representation of what's going on behind the scenes. People and conditions. So we've then got a condition and supplied list. Again, it doesn't tell us all that much. And if I click into it, you can see we're using the same. We've got the same parameters available, but we're not using them. We've got a hard-coded list. So these things like art code is the parameter C349. So I can pull that in there if I wanted to, but in this case, this has just been added as a list of codes. So the various different ways we can do things in RDMP. And then we've got the lung cancer. We can see it's an OR in this case. So we're pulling together people with different things, and we're defining that as lung cancer. So we've got a history of bleeding using these conditions. We've got lung cancer conditions, so that's the C349 again. And we've got a test filter, which I've obviously used for some other purpose to add in a date component. So you kind of see how these things are built up. I wanted to go through it in that way because to make you think about, expanding and contracting the various elements and looking at the different sets that you have and how they're interacting with one another. This is the kind of way I would do a validation, and that's one of the things I do more often than not in RDMP. So another member of my team might set it up, and I'll start with this kind of collapsed hierarchy and work through one line at a time and say, is this really people in hospital admissions? What does this mean? What have we got coming through here? So I wanted to start with that kind of pre-built element. And the other reason, of course, is I can run it and see what happens.
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry. Would you say the naming conventions of these elements in the inclusion are right, or do you think they could be renamed?
Yeah.
The filters that are included inside.
Yeah, I think the key thing that you have to consider there is, lots of things with software come down to less about the kind of what the software allows and more about how you choose to use it. I don't know if everyone caught Jolt's question there, but he was talking about the naming conventions, the way we've named these elements. So people in hospital admissions actually doesn't tell us all that much. So really, if we look at it, we went in and we saw that this was people with C349. So what we probably want to do is change this name to reflect what's actually going on inside. And we can do that by hitting the F2 button, and it'll pop up quite happily. F2 is the common rename button in most software. And we can change the name of that. I think you can also right click, and there might be a rename in there somewhere. Here we go. And we can rename that and change it to be whatever, SMR01. And it makes it much clearer for people to see what's going on. So I highly recommend that. And similarly, when you're adding in the filter, so I've just double clicked on the filter itself. Again, you've got the filter name at the top, and I highly recommend changing those to make clear sense of what's going on. As you can tell, I'm obviously running through something I've edited in the past. It's caused some confusion already. So very much name things well, name things properly, and that should make everything much easier for everyone that's likely to be interacting with this configuration. I'm going to go on to the reason I've chosen another configuration to run. The reason I've picked another one is that this one crashed when I run it. And I'm not too concerned about it crashing because I know I've been fiddling with it in some other presentation. So I've probably just added something that doesn't work. But rather than get bogged down with figuring out what's going wrong now, I want to show you one that's actually running. So I'm more than happy to go back and look at the reason it's crashed if we want to do that, if we've got time to do that later in the session. But for now, I'm going to stick with kind of going through what's going on and trying to figure out what's, well, show you what else you can do. So I mentioned the different icons. You can see here this particular configuration's got accepts and intersects in it. You can see the icon for the accept takes the leftmost component only, and the intersect takes both. So it takes the middle bit, sorry, which is to say people that appear in both. So we've got a slightly different scenario here. And again, my recommendation is always to start by collapsing everything down. So we've got at the very top level, we've got an accept, which, as you know, takes the first thing and excludes any subsequent things. So in this case, it takes the intersect and excludes the diabetic drugs. I can then expand these things and see what we're actually getting. So we're keeping people in this intersect and we're getting rid of people with diabetic drugs. What we're keeping is people with BNF2 intersected with an accept, so that's the leftmost component of what's inside, and that is people over 65. So we've got people over 65 who have not had a hospital admission. So the accept, remember, takes the first set and excludes the second set. So if we kind of work at it backwards, we've got over 65s who have not been in hospital, who have also had a prescription for BNF2, except those with diabetic drugs. Don't know if I've lost everyone there, but hopefully you can start to see how those things come together. I'm going to look at the counts a little bit. In fact, so I mentioned these two count columns, count and cumulative. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the cumulative on. By default, it's not on. We've got this little kind of burger button, as we refer to it, little 3 lines, that's got some additional options. I'm going to click the calculate cumulative totals and then re-execute. And what you'll see is it populates the two count columns here now. And then I'm going to talk you through what these different counts are doing. So the very top layer is our final answer. So that's telling us that there are 7 people available that meet our criteria. And what we can now do is we can look at where the people are dropping off. Firstly, by looking at the count column, which gives us the individual elements. And secondly, by looking at the cumulative, which combines them together. It combines at set level, which is why most of these are empty, because that's within the set. So what we have here is this intersect is giving us 11 people. And then, of course, we're getting rid of people from here, which gives us 7 cumulative. Within the intersect, we can see that people with BNF2, there's 111,000 of those. But of course, we're intersecting that with the element below, which only has 14 people in it, which is reducing our number quite significantly. So we can see, as we start to open up these counts, we can see where things are being lost. We can see there's 50,000 people over 65, and then we get rid of 123,000 people with hospital admissions, leaving us with only 14. So the hospital admissions in over 65s, as you would expect, are high. And we can see here that there's a large drop-off simply in getting rid of anyone with a hospital admission. Does that kind of make sense to people? Is that clear? Are there any questions? I appreciate this is maybe a little bit heavy going for a Friday morning. So we use this cumulative column actually quite a lot when we're building kind of feasibility cohorts, especially in the work we do with Share, for example. So someone will come along and ask for something like this. We'll put it together, and rather than just going back and saying we've got 7 people that meet your criteria, we can go back and say we've got 7 people that meet your criteria. The big drop-off seemed to occur in the hospital admissions, where we've got 123,000 people being excluded, and it only leaves us with 14. And at that point, they can say, okay, well, perhaps we can go back to the researcher, they can maybe relax that criteria, or we can look at it in a different way, or we didn't realise it would have such an effect, or whatever. I mentioned this cache as well. You can see the cache numbers are all completed, they're all filled in. And as I say, what that means is that RDMP behind the scenes has taken the CHI list that this criteria is building and stored it temporarily to allow us to execute it very quickly. So again, you see if I hit the execute button, it all comes together pretty quickly because it's just taken these pre-canned CHI lists rather than going straight back to our full data set. If we decide that actually we don't want people over 65, we want people over 60, so we can change our value. So I'm just changing the value here to 60, and I've changed the title just to match. And we can ignore the bit of SQL that's doing the work for us, but we know that we've changed the age. I can then close that, and what we will see is because I've changed this filter, it no longer appears in the cache list. So it's not cached anymore. That means it's going to go back to the database and it's going to run that from scratch. And the reason for that is, of course, we're not looking at the same people anymore. We're looking at a different set. And similarly, I can change my label here. Let's change it to 60 and rerun it again, and you will see it caches as it's going. So it's now cached that as I run it, and you can see our count's now up to 10 because we've relaxed our criteria. And then if I run that again, I can it will cache it. It will run from the cache. Sorry. If you're interested in getting into the proper technical bit, you can right-click at the very top and you can view the SQL code that it's building. I'm not sure of those on the call what your experience is with SQL, so don't worry about this if this isn't for you. I'm not going to dwell on it too much. What I'm going to highlight here is this is using a cohort cache, and in the SQL you can see this intersect and accept logic coming through, and these are all just selects from cache tables because it's cached. So for each of these elements, when you see these green comments in here, those are exactly the names that we have here. So we've got people in demography over 60, and I've got a comment that says people in demography over 60. This line here is going to take the CHIs for people in demography over 60. If I click this use cache if available box to not use the cache, this is the actual SQL that's running on our server behind the scenes. So in this case, you can see it's going right back to our prescribing data set. It's looking for format IBNF code 2. We've got an age calculation, and it's greater than age, which is up here declared as 60. And you can kind of see again how that's pulling it all together. Depending on how technical you are, sometimes you might be interested in looking at that. You might be interested in taking it into the database and doing a little bit more analysis on what RDMP is doing, or you may not. We use it occasionally, but most of the time we tend to use it if we find something that either looks we're uncertain of it, and it is very much it's a human thing. You look at it and think that can't be right, and then we put it into SQL, and of course it is right because the computer says so. But sometimes you want to go back and have that reassurance, looking at the data that it's actually looking at, and we can see it in that manner. Similarly, you can disable components. So let's say, what can I disable here that would actually make sense? Let's say we no longer want to exclude those with diabetic drugs. I can just right-click it and disable, and you'll see it turns grey and changes to italics. And if I run that again, you can see our count has changed again. We're now up to 14 people because we're no longer excluding the people who are on diabetic drugs. So hopefully you can see how that could be useful in kind of fine-tuning how the cohort works, or how the cohort's built. especially if the researchers, as they often seem to be with us, aren't 100% on what it is that they want. There might be a little bit of, oh, well, if there's more than 1,000 of those, then that's what I want. But if not, I'm going to have to relax the criteria. We have the options to do these kind of things. I'm just going to bring up my little Word document and see if we've covered most of the stuff I was going to cover. Okay, so that's the overview of how we see Cohort Builder, how we interpret what Cohort Builder is telling us. Last time around, I think I did a quick run over how we would piece something together. So we'll do that now. Maybe I'll start something from scratch and just very quickly go through. So let's say we're just going to start a new free configuration. So we can right-click on free configurations and create new, or indeed we can use the file menu and we can have new, and in here a cohort identification configuration. A couple of different ways we can do it, or indeed we can just right-click in the free space and create a new one. So let's give it a name, and that gives us as you can see, an empty configuration. Now you'll see that we have an inclusion and exclusion set already created in here by default. RDMP does that just to give you a kind of a starting structure. You'll also see that inclusion criteria is bright red, and the reason for that is that little tooltip that's come up, which if you can't see it says that it's an empty container set and it has no effect. So basically this container is being ignored because there's nothing in it. You can tell the inclusion criteria is a union, so you're including everyone with these conditions. It's a union, you're pulling them all together. And the exclusion criteria is is an accept, so it's taking the inclusion criteria and excluding everything else. So let's start to build something together. I'm very much winging it, so if anyone's got any suggestions, I'm happy to take them. We can have a look at what data sets we've got, or I'll just start putting together some slightly obscure cohort that may or may not make sense. Again, right-click context menu. So I'm going to add this into our inclusion criteria. I'm going to add in a catalogue of the catalogues that we have available of what we've got in our test data set. So biochem, demography, prescribing, hospital admissions. So let's start with demography. In fact, let's add demography and prescribing. Let's have a couple of things in there. And you'll see that it adds it in. This is a change to a plus sign, and then the inclusion criteria is no longer red. So it now has purpose. It has meaning. We're now creating an inclusion criteria of anyone who is in our demography data and also our prescribing data. That's lots of people, so let's kind of drill it down a little bit. I'll right-click the people in prescribing in this case, and we'll add in a new filter from our catalogue. Let's say we want, we'll take a BNF section primarily because I can't remember what years the sample data covers and always end up with 0 when I use the year function. And we get, so we've just got formatted BNF code like, I usually go with 6 because it's diabetes and we do a lot of diabetes work in, within HIC. So we've now got people in prescribing. Let's change it to say diabetes, just to reflect what we've actually got. I guess I should have changed that as well to BNF section 6. I'll mention the kind of saving and stuff like that actually. So you'll see that as I make a change, you'll see a little star appears up here, just like you get in many other applications. I hit the save button and didn't mention it, but if I close it without saving it, of course we get a little thing just saying, would you like to save this now? So just, I'm not trying to hide anything, I'm just, I guess I'm used to hitting the save button because it's there. But we've now got people in BNF6 and people in demography, so we're, oh, don't want to do that. I want to add create a new filter from catalogue. So we've got an example of older than X years, so let's go with that. And we've got 16, so we're creating 16. Let's limit it a little bit more. Let's say 40. There we go. So we've now got change the title older than 40. Save that one. So we've now got people in demography older than 40. So we've now got basically over 40 diabetics. That's where we're aiming at here. What we're aiming at here. We can change the inclusion criteria if we want. We can change that to say diabetics over 40. Just makes it a little bit clearer for us. And what I tend to do when I'm building these things is I just collapse them as I've done it. So I can now see that I've got an inclusion criteria of diabetics over 40. I've got no exclusion criteria. If we execute it at this time, it will run off and give us some numbers. So our sample data gives us about 102,000 people. Let's say we want to exclude some people. So let's right click and add a catalogue into the exclusion, and let's exclude some hospital admissions. So the first thing I'm going to mention is that I've just added something to an accept container, and if you take anything at all from the presentation from earlier, order is the thing you need to take from it. So what this is currently doing is taking everyone in the first set, because it's an accept, and excluding everyone in the second set. So we're taking people with hospital admissions and we're throwing away diabetics over 40. That's where order becomes important, because we've just broken our criteria. We've got it backwards. And all we do here is we click and drag. And you see RDMP comes up with a little thing saying reorder aggregate container, and the green line shows you where it's going to go. So if I put it here, it's going to put it exactly where it is at the moment. If I put it above, then it puts it above. And I'm now keeping my inclusion criteria and throwing away hospital admissions. So that's when we're talking about order, that's exactly what we're talking about. And as we know from the PowerPoint, accepts are where it's most important. Again, we can create a filter from our catalogue. We can have ICD code as the example. And let's take heart failure as the example. And we've now got IV50 pre-canned and run it. So we've now got diabetics over 40, except those with heart failure. And we've got, is it still on? Oh, we've got none with heart failure, okay. And my sample data has let me down, unfortunately. But yes, so we can hopefully see how that comes together, and hopefully that makes sense.
Questions?
Yes.
So when you are trying to provide apply filters on those data set, I noticed that the options for the filters are quite limited. So is the user able to create their own filter, or we have to use
absolutely? No, absolutely. So what we can do is we've got create new filter from catalog, and as Chang says, that this is limited. Now this is limited by whatever your kind of administrator sets up in advance. Because this is a test system, it is incredibly limited. If we were to look at well, like our live instance, and in fact, if I got it open, let's see if I can just flick to a live instance. So I think I've got, oh, that's good. Security as always. If we go to a live instance, and totally unprepared for this, sorry guys. Nope, that's an extraction. Cohort builder. Actually, I can show that as well. So now that you see this ribbon, I've clicked on cohort builder. If I unpin it, here is the list of cohort identification configurations that we have that are project associated. So you can see there's quite a lot of stuff in here. If I open the free ones as well, you can see I've got even more stuff in here. So it's a massive list. Control F find becomes a massively important way of getting around RDMP. So what I'm going to do is use this training day, one that I've used in the past. And let's say if I right click in here, so this is a SMR1 filter, and I create from catalog, you can see in this case there's a whole bunch more stuff in here. So this is all about how much setup you do, or your administrator does it beforehand. We tend to find that there's probably about a dozen or so things that you're likely to query quite a lot, and usually a lot of the things just become edits of those. So you can see the sort of stuff we've got for hospital admissions. There's about the ICD or OPCS codes. There's a lot of stuff about dates, and they tend to be kind of cover most of the questions. If I go back to our test instance, what we can also do, instead of create from catalog, we can just create a new filter, and it just gives us this window that you've been seeing before, but it's completely empty. Basically, what you're doing here is you're expected to write some SQL code. So if you're familiar with SQL, that's the way you can do it. And one of the most important features here is this bit at the bottom. It says control plus space to show objects. So if I control space, I get this little drop down. And in this list, I get all the columns that are available to me in the data set. So this is restricted to the data set I'm looking at. So we might wish to add something like discharge date. So you see, I just double click discharge date, it puts the SQL in for me. I could put something like, you know, whatever I want, a discharge date that's less than today, for example. And that's, we can then just we can add that in, and we can add in a little description for it. And then we can save it in that, and it will be used in our query. We can also use the little burger. I don't save it. We can also use this little burger button, the 3-line button, to publish the filter. So we can publish it. It asks us for a column that we're publishing it against. In this case, as you know, it's against the discharge date column that we're using. So if I select that, it tells me it's published successfully. What that means is that when I now go back to create from catalog, you can see I've just created discharge before today. It's now in our list. So it's as simple as that to add a filter, you know, from the kind of administrator level. What I will say is there's a couple of things that you need to be aware of. For example, you cannot publish a blank filter. It's pointless. It doesn't mean anything. Let's say I put, I don't know, what have we got? Main operation. So let's just say is null, right? So no main operation. Let's say I want to publish that. I can't publish that either because there's no description. So RDP is forcing us to go through these elements. No operation took place. So we're just saying it's null. And again, of course, it's not going to let me publish it with no description. I can't remember, there's a character limit. It looks for something like 20 characters or something like that in the description. And you can see now I can publish the filter. Of course, you can add in more stuff. There's also this is mandatory box. And what that does is it will always add that filter. If you make it mandatory, it always adds the filter when you add the catalog to your criteria. So we probably don't want to do that in this case, but you might have things like, you know, maybe you're aware that you've got records with no chi number, so you might want to add where chi is not null to your, you know, as a mandatory filter. We've got a couple like that. Or you might want to do, you know, maybe you've got some data that's you know there's some issues with it and you want to exclude, so you can add those as mandatory, or you know, data that appears from other health boards or whatever. Again, I can associate this with the column main operation, and it's published. So you can see it's quite quick and easy to build up these things, these filters that we can then reuse. Or indeed, we can just not publish it, and it could be something specific to this project that, you know, we don't plan to use again. I'm going to change this to an or, hopefully try and get some number out. I'm aware of the time, however, so perhaps I should kind of wrap up and look at questions, because I think are we due to finish in 8 minutes, or is it maybe longer than here we are? Yeah, so you see I've managed to get 35 people. And of course, in this case, I'm looking at hospital admissions where they were discharged before today, or they had a heart failure, or there was no operation. So keep in mind that or means that you're effectively piecing together. It's almost like a union, I guess, if we think about the set theory again. Are there any questions here at all? I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. Okay, so I guess that's cohort building. Well, that's certainly the kind of the beginnings of cohort building. I obviously haven't covered things like patient index tables. That's something we can talk about at a later time. Hopefully you'll all be able to kind of get set up and go off and try some cohort building yourself. What might be quite good is if you're all using the same test data set, it might be quite good if you put something together and then ask one of your colleagues to try and replicate it, and you can hopefully come up with the same number. That would be a good sign that you're both doing the same thing. And yeah, keep thinking about things like order and renaming these labels to make things that make sense. Okay. Anything from anyone else? Anything that's... I guess we'll let you digest that one then. Yeah, I think it's very useful, and hopefully you can see how these things come together. These things aren't things that we're going to throw away either. We can effectively, what we're going to get out of this is a Chi list, and that's where this commit cohort button comes from, and that's kind of the next stage. That then gives us a frozen in time list of people, basically, that we can then build a project extraction for. And of course, the configuration we can go back and run to rebuild at a later date. We can also do things like at the top level, so this is the configuration that we've just built. We can do things like clone it, so we can make an exact copy of it, and then we can start to use that for another project, so we can use it as a basis. If we clone it, just to give you, so you can see here, we can rename it, let's call it we can go into that and we can instantly go in and say, oh, well, actually, we're not interested in that bit, so we can just delete that. And, we can get rid of these things really quickly. And we can add in additional filters to say, actually, we're interested in, let's leave it as 8. We're interested in BNF section 8. So we've now got so we should rename that 8. So we've now got 6 people in 6 and 8, maybe it's 6 or 8. So we've now got anyone that's got a prescription in 6 or 8. We can change that to March. Yeah, so hopefully you can see the power behind it anyway, and how easy it is to reuse it, but also not to kind of overwrite your other bits. So we've still got the existing one that we had in the first place that we can reuse in that way. Okay, I guess we'll wrap up for today then, if there's no questions. And as I say, hopefully you can all get up and running before next time and have a look at things and see what's what.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chris.
No problem.
We'll do our best to get ourselves set up properly for next time.
Yeah.
And yeah, we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Okay, I mean, if you need anything, meanwhile, obviously hit the teams, ask questions. If you want, we can always put together a 15-minute or 30-minute meet just to have a discussion over something if there's any need, especially on the technical side, to get you up and running. As always, yeah, stick questions in the teams, interact with us. We will answer what we can. And thank you all for your time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye, folks. Well, Joel, you've gone, okay.